Old Baker helps 20 Hell's Angels. During a Christmas Eve storm, on Christmas Day, 200 bikers show up at his bakery. The sweet, warm air of Frank Porter's bakery was instantly sliced by the roar. It wasn't the Christmas Eve quiet he treasured. It was a low, mechanical thunder that grew louder, closer. Frank, flour dusting his gray hair, looked up from his cinnamon rolls. The glass of his front window became a frame for 20 twin yellow headlights, cutting through the heavy snow. The machines didn't cruise by. They turned, their engines growling in unison as they pulled into his small, snow-covered parking lot. 20 motorcycles, 20 massive shapes in black leather and chains, dismounting their bikes. Even through the swirling white curtain, Frank could see the unmistakable patches of the Hell's Angels. A sudden chill, colder than the 0-degree air outside, ran down his spine. The radio played Silent Night. The front door bell, which had announced kindly Mrs. Henderson earlier, now chimed with an unsettling finality. The first man through the door was a giant. He filled the doorway, his leather cut off thick with patches, his beard frosted with snow. He stopped, letting the cold air and the smell of wet leather invade the warm aroma of vanilla and yeast. Behind him crowded 3 others, equally large, their faces hard and weathered. The lead biker's eyes, small and cold under a thick brow, surveyed the bakery, the twinkling Christmas lights, the ceramic snowmen, the half-finished tray of cinnamon rolls. "You're open late, old man," the biker said, his voice a low, gravelly sound that seemed too loud for the small space. Frank, hands trembling slightly, wiped them on his apron. He took a deep breath, letting the familiar scent of Marge's famous recipe steal him. "Christmas Eve," he replied, his voice steady despite the hammer of his heart. "Someone always needs something sweet." The biker didn't smile. He just shifted his weight, and the chains on his vest rattled. He glanced at the counter, then back at Frank. "We don't want sweet," he stated, his cold eyes locking on Frank's. "We want the bag." Frank stared back, the question visible on his flour-dusted face. Another voice, sharper and impatient, came from the group by the door. "Don't play games, Baker. You heard about the drop. The package left the city this afternoon. Our intel says the driver was forced to ditch it somewhere nearby before the storm hit. We tracked the signal to this block. You're the only business open. Where is it?" Frank Porter suddenly understood why his small-town, late-night Christmas bakery was the center of 20 terrifying Hell's Angels on a freezing night. His heart went from racing to sinking. I don't know what you're talking about," Frank stammered, his expertise with dough suddenly useless. "I'm just making." The lead biker didn't wait for him to finish. He reached across the counter, his massive gloved hand slamming down on the worn wood. Inches from Frank's cinnamon rolls. "We ain't asking twice," he snarled. "The bag. Now." The bell above the door chimed frantically as the bikers pushed their way inside, stomping snow from their heavy boots. Their leather jackets creaked as they moved, filling Frank's small bakery with the sharp scent of worn leather and motorcycle exhaust. Some wore patches that marked them as Hell's Angels, while others had tattoos climbing up their necks and across their knuckles. Frank's weathered hands tightened around the wooden rolling pin, more from instinct than intent. The weight of it was familiar, comforting even, though he knew in his heart he wouldn't need it. His wife Marge had always told him that kindness was the best defense, and he'd learned over his 70-some years that she was usually right. "Evening, gentlemen," Frank called out, his voice steady and warm despite the nervous flutter in his chest. "You picked a good night to come in from the cold." The biggest of the group, a mountain of a man with a thick beard streaked with gray, turned to face him. His eyes, hard as steel, searched Frank's face for any sign of fear or judgment, but Frank just smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling behind his wire-rimmed glasses. "Got fresh coffee brewing? And the hot cocoa's always ready this time of year?" Frank continued, gesturing to the copper pot that sat on the warmer. "Nothing better for warming up on a night like this." The bikers exchanged glances, clearly thrown off by the old baker's easy manner. A few of them shifted uncomfortably, their leather jackets squeaking against the backed chairs at the counter. "You're not going to tell us to leave?" one of them asked, his voice gruff but uncertain. Frank shook his head as he reached for clean mugs. "Way I see it, you're just folks looking to get out of the cold. Coffee's $3, but the first cup's on the house tonight. It is Christmas Eve, after all." The tension in the room began to ease as Frank moved behind the counter, pouring steaming coffee into a row of mugs. The rich aroma seemed to cut through the leather and gasoline, filling the bakery with its familiar comfort. "Hot cocoa's made with real chocolate," Frank added, already preparing a few cups. "My Marge's recipe. She always said, there's nothing a cup of good cocoa can't improve." One by one, the bikers settled onto the stools at the counter or into the small tables by the window. Their voices, though still rough, grew quieter as they wrapped cold hands around warm mugs. Frank noticed a few of them eyeing the display case filled with pies and pastries. "Those fresh?" another biker asked, nodding toward a golden brown apple pie. "Everything's made fresh daily," Frank replied, already reaching for a knife and plates. "This one came out of the oven about an hour ago." As he served generous slices of pie, Frank could see the surprise in their eyes at his easy acceptance of their presence. One of the younger bikers, his arms covered in colorful tattoos, took a sip of cocoa and let out a low whistle of appreciation. "You're not like the others, old man," he said, shaking his head. "Most people see us coming and lock their doors." Frank just smiled as he placed another slice of pie on the counter. The warmth in his expression reached all the way to his eyes, genuine and unchanging. Years of serving people from all walks of life had taught him that everyone deserved a chance at kindness, especially on a cold Christmas Eve. The warmth of fresh-baked goods and hot coffee filled the bakery as the bikers settled in, their leather jackets creaking against the worn counter stools. Frank wiped his hands on his flour-dusted apron, watching as they enjoyed their food. The storm outside had gotten worse, rattling the old windows with each gust. A tall, broad-shouldered man with a graying beard approached the counter. His weathered face and stern expression marked him as the leader. "Name's Razor," he said, his voice surprisingly soft despite his imposing presence. Frank nodded, noting the concern in Razor's eyes. "Everything all right with the food?" "Food's great, but—" Razor glanced over his shoulder at a woman sitting quietly in the corner. She was pale, her hands trembling slightly as she held her cup. "We've got a situation. One of our own, Darla. She's diabetic. Her sugar's dropping bad. And with this storm," he ran a hand through his beard, "nearest hospital's 20 miles out. Roads are complete ice now." Frank studied Darla more carefully. Her leather vest couldn't hide how she hugged herself, trying to stay warm. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the chill, and her eyes had a glassy look that Frank recognized all too well. "How long has she been like this?" Frank asked, already moving toward the back of the bakery. "About an hour. Getting worse." Razor's tough exterior cracked slightly. "Look, I know we're not exactly the kind of folks you usually deal with, but—" "Nonsense," Frank cut him off. "People are people. Wait here." Frank hurried to his small office, his old joints protesting the quick movement. He pulled open the bottom drawer of his desk, pushing aside papers until he found the emergency kit he kept there. Years of running a public establishment had taught him to be prepared. Returning to the main room, he made his way to Darla's table. The other bikers parted, creating a path for him. Up close, he could see her hands shaking more severely. "Hello, Darla," Frank said gently, setting his kit on the table. "I'm going to help you, if that's okay." She nodded weakly, her tough exterior giving way to relief at the promise of help. Frank worked methodically, checking her symptoms with practiced ease. He pulled out a glucose meter, kept on hand since his wife's later years, and quickly tested her blood sugar. The reading confirmed his suspicions. "Too low," he muttered, reaching into his kit. He pulled out a tube of glucose gel and some juice boxes he kept for young customers. "Here, Darla, get this gel under your tongue first. Then sip the juice slowly." The other bikers watched in amazed silence as Frank tended to their friend. He spoke softly to her, explaining each step, keeping her calm as the glucose began to take effect. Color gradually returned to her cheeks, and her hands steadied. Razor stood nearby, his presence protective but uncertain. As Darla's condition improved, he placed a heavy hand on Frank's shoulder. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. Their eyes met, and Frank saw something shift in the biker's expression, a deep respect, tinged with gratitude. "You know your way around this stuff," Razor observed. "My Marge, my wife, she had diabetes too," Frank replied simply, patting Darla's hand as she finished the juice. "You learn what to do when someone you love needs help." The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the bakery, something had changed. The tension had melted away like snow in spring, replaced by a warmth that had nothing to do with the ovens. The howling wind rattled the bakery's windows, but inside, warmth and the sweet smell of cinnamon filled the air. Frank watched as Darla, now recovered from her diabetic episode, sat wrapped in a blanket he'd found in the back room. Her eyes, though tired, held genuine gratitude. "I can't thank you enough," she said softly, clutching a mug of hot chocolate between her hands. "Most people see our patches and run the other way." Frank pulled up a chair, his joints creaking as he settled into it. "Well, I've learned that patches don't tell the whole story of a person." The other bikers, scattered around the small bakery in various states of comfort, nodded in agreement. Some sat at the counter, while others had pulled chairs into small circles. The storm outside had created an unexpected sanctuary, forcing them all to seek shelter together. One of the younger bikers, his leather vest covered in patches, spoke up. "You remind me of my grandpa," he said, his voice catching slightly. "He never judged me either, even when everyone else did." Frank smiled, remembering his own journey. Life has a way of teaching us that people are more than what they seem at first glance. Razor, who had been quietly observing from his spot near the window, walked over and pulled up a chair next to Frank. His massive frame made the bakery chair look almost comically small, but his expression was sincere. "You know, Porter," Razor said, using Frank's last name with respect, "we've been riding together for years, but I've never seen anyone treat us with such kindness." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Most folks see us coming and lock their doors." Frank shrugged, his weathered hands folded in his lap. "My Marge always said that kindness costs nothing but means everything." The mention of Marge brought a familiar ache to his chest, but it was a warm kind of pain now, like an old friend visiting. The bikers listened as Frank shared a few stories about her, about how she'd helped him build this bakery into what it was, how she'd always made sure there was extra food for those who couldn't afford it. As the night wore on, the bikers shared their own stories, tales of broken homes, lost dreams, and found family among their motorcycle brothers and sisters. Frank listened, offering gentle words of wisdom when asked, but mostly just providing a caring ear. Finally, Razor stood up, his expression thoughtful. "Listen, old man," he said, his voice gruff but kind. "We're heading to a town nearby for Christmas Eve. Got some friends there who always throw a celebration. Why don't you come with us?" Frank's heart skipped a beat at the unexpected invitation. He looked around at the faces watching him. Faces that had softened over the past few hours, faces that now showed genuine warmth and respect. I appreciate the offer," Frank said slowly, his hand unconsciously touching the wedding ring he still wore. "But this bakery, it's where Marge and I built our life. Christmas Eve was always special for us here. Razor nodded, understanding in his eyes. You're a good man, Porter. Not many would have done what you did tonight. The rest of the bikers began gathering their things, preparing to brave the storm again. As they put on their heavy leather jackets, each one thanked Frank personally. "We'll be back," Razor promised, his voice carrying the weight of certainty. "You've earned our respect, and that's not something we give lightly." The roar of motorcycles faded into the howling wind as Frank stood at his bakery window, watching the last of the Hell's Angels disappear into the swirling snow. Their taillights glowed like red fireflies before vanishing completely into the white darkness. The old baker's shoulders slumped slightly, and he pressed his weathered hand against the cold glass. "Well, that's that," he muttered to himself, but his voice carried a hint of something he hadn't felt in years. Regret, maybe, or longing. The bakery felt strangely empty now, despite the lingering scent of leather and exhaust mixed with sweet cinnamon and chocolate. Frank shuffled around the counter, gathering empty coffee cups and plates. His movements were slower than usual, his mind replaying the evening's events. The bikers' laughter still echoed in his ears. Not the harsh, intimidating sound he'd expected, but genuine warmth that had filled his bakery with life. As he wiped down the counter, his cloth brushed against something that hadn't been there before. A plain white envelope sat propped against the napkin holder, his name written across it in bold, angular handwriting. Frank picked it up, turning it over in his hands. The paper was thick and slightly rough, like the kind used for greeting cards. "Now what's this?" he wondered aloud, carefully opening the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once. The message was short, written in the same strong hand as the envelope. "You're one of us now. Don't forget it." Frank read the words 3 times, his throat tightening unexpectedly. He thought of Razor's face when he'd helped Darla, the way the tough biker's eyes had softened with gratitude. He remembered how the group had listened intently when he'd mentioned Marge, offering quiet words of understanding instead of empty sympathy. The old baker sank onto one of the counter stools, still holding the note. The Christmas lights he'd strung around the windows cast soft colors across the paper. When was the last time someone had reached out to him like this? The regulars who came for their daily bread were friendly enough, but this was different. This felt like belonging. His gaze drifted to the shelf behind the counter where he kept special things, a photo of Marge on their wedding day, her favorite rolling pin, the first $1 he'd earned at the bakery. With careful movements, Frank stood and walked over to the shelf. He reached up, his joints protesting slightly, and placed the note between Marge's photo and a small ceramic angel she'd always loved. His fingers lingered on the paper for a moment. "What would you think of all this, my dear?" he whispered to Marge's smiling face. "Me? Making friends with a bunch of bikers on Christmas Eve?" The answer came to him immediately. She would have loved it. Marge had always seen the good in people, always welcomed strangers with open arms and fresh cookies. Maybe that's why helping the bikers had felt so natural. It's exactly what she would have done. Frank finished closing up the bakery, his movements automatic after decades of practice. He turned off the ovens, covered the remaining pastries, and counted the register. But his mind kept wandering to the note on the shelf and the possibility it represented. Could his life really change at his age? Was there room for new adventures? New connections? The questions followed him as he turned off the lights and headed up the narrow stairs to his apartment above the bakery. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside, Frank's world felt somehow larger than it had that morning. The morning sun painted the snow-covered town in shades of gold and pink. Frank Porter buttoned up his thick wool coat, checking twice to make sure he had fresh flowers wrapped carefully in paper for Marge's grave. Christmas morning had always been their special time together, and even now, years after her passing, he kept their tradition alive. The streets were empty and peaceful, just as he expected. Most folks were probably still in their pajamas, watching children tear through wrapped presents or preparing holiday feasts. Frank's boots crunched in the fresh snow as he stepped onto his front porch, pausing to take in the crisp winter air. Something felt different this morning. The usual quiet of Christmas Day was broken by a distant rumble. At first, Frank thought it might be snowplows clearing the roads, but the sound grew louder and more distinct. It wasn't the grinding of plows at all, it was the unmistakable growl of motorcycle engines. "What in the world?" Frank muttered to himself, squinting down the street. The noise grew stronger, echoing off the buildings of Main Street. A few early risers peeked out their windows, curious about the commotion. Frank's heart picked up its pace as he remembered last night's visitors. Could it be them again? He started walking. The wrapped flowers clutched tightly in his gloved hands. The rumbling grew louder with each step. As he turned the corner onto Main Street, his jaw dropped at the sight before him. Motorcycles lined both sides of the street, stretching as far as he could see. There were bikes of every make and model, their chrome parts gleaming in the morning sun. The riders stood in groups, their leather jackets decorated with patches from different clubs. Some were warming their hands with cups of coffee, while others talked and laughed in the morning chill. Frank's legs felt weak as he made his way toward his bakery. The crowd of bikers parted respectfully, creating a path for him. Some nodded in greeting. Others smiled warmly. These weren't just the Hells Angels from last night. There were members from numerous motorcycle clubs, all gathered outside his humble bakery. Near the bakery's entrance stood Razor, his massive frame easily recognizable. When he spotted Frank, a broad smile spread across his face. "Merry Christmas, old man," he called out, his voice carrying over the crowd. Frank's hands trembled, still clutching the flowers meant for Marge's grave. He looked around at the sea of faces, some weathered and tough, others young and eager, all gathered here for him. The sheer number of people was overwhelming. 200 bikers, maybe more, had ridden through the winter morning to his bakery. I don't understand," Frank managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. Razor stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on Frank's shoulder. "Word travels fast in our community," he explained. "We told other clubs about what you did for us last night. How you took us in without judgment. How you saved Darla's life. Not many people would show that kind of kindness to a bunch of bikers on Christmas Eve." Frank stood there, rooted to the spot, as bikers from different clubs approached him. Their eyes held genuine warmth and respect. Some had traveled from neighboring towns, others from different states, all to show their appreciation for one simple act of kindness. The flowers in his hands suddenly felt very light, and his heart very full. For the first time in years, Frank Porter found himself completely speechless, overwhelmed by this extraordinary display of gratitude on Christmas morning. The bell above the door chimed endlessly as bikers filed into Frank's bakery. The small space, usually quiet and filled with just the scent of fresh bread, now buzzed with energy and leather-clad figures. Frank stood behind his counter, his weathered hands gripping the edge for support as he took in the incredible sight before him. "Make way! Make way!" Razor's voice boomed over the crowd. He carried a large package wrapped in brown paper. Behind him, others held various boxes and bags. "We've got something for you, old man." Frank's eyes widened as Razor placed the package on the counter. "You didn't have to." "Open it," Razor insisted, a rare smile crossing his face. With trembling fingers, Frank unwrapped the package. Inside was a pristine leather jacket, similar to the ones the bikers wore, but with special patches that read Honorary Angel and Baker's Brigade. The leather was soft and smelled new, nothing like the worn jackets the others wore. "We had it made special," one of the bikers called out. "Your family now." Before Frank could respond, more gifts appeared. A group of women bikers presented him with containers full of homemade cookies. "We wanted to return the buys. Favor," one said. her eyes twinkling. "Though they might not be as good as yours." Two burly men stepped forward, carrying between them a wooden sign. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Carved into the rich oak were the words "Porter's Bakery," surrounded by intricate designs of motorcycles and angel wings. "Made it myself," a tall biker with tattoo-covered arms said quietly. "Been doing woodwork since I was a kid." Frank touched the sign gently, tracing the letters with his finger. His throat felt tight, and he blinked rapidly to keep the tears at bay. The bakery filled with warmth as bodies pressed together, sharing stories and laughter. The usually pristine floor now bore the marks of snow-covered boots. But Frank couldn't bring himself to mind. Someone had started a pot of coffee, and the familiar aroma mixed with the smell of leather and motor oil. Eventually, Frank found himself seated at the counter, surrounded by Razor and a few other bikers. The noise in the bakery had settled to a comfortable hum as groups chatted among themselves. "Never thought I'd end up here," a biker named Mike said, his coffee cup cradled between tattooed hands. The bell above the bakery door chimed constantly as more people filtered in from the street. Frank watched in amazement as his usually quiet shop transformed into what felt like Grand Central Station. Mrs. Henderson from the flower shop across the street was one of the first townspeople to venture inside, her silver hair tucked neatly under a winter hat, curiosity written all over her face. "Franklin Porter, what in heaven's name is going on here?" she asked, eyes wide as she took in the sea of leather jackets and tattooed arms. Before Frank could answer, Razor stepped forward, removing his leather gloves. "Ma'am, we're here because your neighbor is a hero. Saved one of our own last night during the storm." His voice was gentle, nothing like what Mrs. Henderson had clearly expected. Word spread quickly through the small town. Soon, Mr. Johnson from the hardware store appeared, followed by the Peters family and their 3 children. The kids stared in wonder at the bikers' patches and elaborate motorcycles visible through the frosted windows. "I've never seen anything like this," whispered Tom Peters to his wife, watching as a burly biker with a thick beard helped their youngest daughter reach a cookie on a high shelf. Frank moved through the crowd, making sure everyone had something warm to drink. The atmosphere in the bakery was unlike anything he'd experienced since Marge passed away. The bikers shared stories of their cross-country adventures, while townspeople listened with rapt attention. Even Sheriff Mills stopped by, initially concerned about the gathering, but soon found himself engaged in conversation with a group of riders about vintage motorcycles. "You know, Frank," said Sarah Miller, who ran the local diner, "I've lived here 30 years, and I've never seen the town come together quite like this." She gestured to where her teenage son was getting a lesson in motorcycle maintenance from 2 leather-clad bikers. The warmth in the bakery wasn't just from the ovens anymore. Laughter echoed off the walls, and the aroma of coffee mixed with the lingering scent of cinnamon rolls. Frank noticed how the initial tension had melted away, replaced by genuine curiosity and connection. Little Emily Peters had climbed onto a biker's lap and was showing him her favorite Christmas toy, while her parents watched nearby, their previous apprehension replaced with warm smiles. The biker, whose patch identified him as Beast, was as gentle as a lamb, admiring the doll with exaggerated interest. "Your bakery's something special, Frank," Razor said, appearing at his side. "Look at all these people. They came in scared of us. But now—" He gestured to where Mrs. Henderson was teaching a group of bikers how to properly fold napkins for a formal dinner setting. Frank leaned against his counter, taking in the scene before him. The bakery that had felt so empty for so long was now bursting with life. Children darted between legs, both denim-clad and suit-covered. The distinction between townspeople and bikers had somehow blurred into something else entirely: community. For the first time in years, Frank felt the familiar warmth he used to experience when Marge was alive, and the bakery was the heart of the town. He watched as more people arrived, drawn by the unusual gathering, each one welcomed with the same warmth and respect that he'd shown those first 20 bikers the night before. This wasn't just his bakery anymore. Somehow, it had become something more, a place where barriers broke down and strangers became friends. The loneliness that had been his constant companion since Marge's passing felt lighter, replaced by the warmth of genuine human connection. The morning sun filtered through the bakery's frosted windows, casting long shadows across the empty tables where, just yesterday, dozens of bikers had gathered. Frank stood behind the counter, his weathered hands methodically kneading dough, but his mind wandered to the events of the past few days. The quiet of the bakery felt different now. Not lonely exactly, but filled with echoes of laughter and conversation that had transformed his small shop into something more vibrant. He could still smell the leather from their jackets, mixing with the scent of fresh bread and cinnamon. Frank paused his work to wipe his hands on his apron, leaving small traces of flour. His eyes drifted to the shelf where several small gifts from the bikers sat. A decorated cookie tin, a small carved wooden motorcycle, and a card signed by dozens of people he'd never met before Christmas Day. Marge would have loved this, he whispered to himself, a small smile tugging at his lips. She always said the bakery needed more life in it. The morning light caught the silver chain of his pocket watch, a gift from Marge 30 years ago. He pulled it out, checking the time. 7:35. Usually, his regular customers would be trickling in by now, but the streets were still quiet after the holiday. Frank's thoughts drifted to Razor and how the tough biker's exterior had softened when talking about his own past. It reminded him that everyone had a story, just as he had his own. The connection he'd felt with the group surprised him. They were so different from his usual circle, yet somehow they had awakened something in him he thought had died with Marge. The shrill ring of the telephone cut through his reverie. Frank picked up the receiver, his flour-dusted fingers leaving white marks on the black plastic. "Porter's Bakery," he answered, his voice warm and professional. "Frank? It's Gerald Matthews." The landlord's voice crackled through the line, lacking its usual friendliness. Frank's stomach tightened. Gerald rarely called unless there was a problem. "Good morning, Gerald. What can I do for you?" "Look, Frank, I'll get straight to the point. The property management company's raising rates across the whole block, with the economy the way it is, and that storm damage we had last month." Gerald's voice trailed off. Frank's free hand gripped the edge of the counter, his knuckles turning white. "How much of an increase are we talking about?" The number, Gerald quoted, made Frank's heart skip a beat. It was nearly double what he was paying now. "I'm sorry, Frank. I tried to fight it, but they're not budging. You've got 60 days to either accept the new rate or—" Gerald left the sentence unfinished. Frank stood in silence, the phone heavy in his hand. The morning sun suddenly felt cold on his skin, and the familiar walls of his bakery seemed to close in around him. "I understand," he managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for letting me know, Gerald." After hanging up the phone, Frank stood motionless behind the counter. The bakery, his sanctuary, his connection to Marge, his entire world for the past 40 years felt like it was slipping through his fingers like grains of sand. His eyes swept across the space. The worn spot on the counter where countless elbows had rested, the mark on the wall where Marge had once accidentally splashed cake batter, the window where he'd watched generations of children press their noses against the glass to admire his cookies and cakes. Frank's shoulders sagged as the weight of reality settled over him. Everything he'd built, everything he'd preserved in memory of Marge, was at risk of disappearing. He placed both hands flat on the counter, steadying himself as the morning sun continued to stream through the windows, oblivious to how his world had just shifted on its axis. Frank sat at his usual spot behind the counter, his weathered hands wrapped around a lukewarm cup of coffee. The morning sun streamed through the windows, making the fresh snow outside sparkle like diamonds. But the beauty outside couldn't lift the weight that had settled in his chest after the landlord's call. The familiar jingle of the doorbell made him look up. Janet, Marge's sister, walked in with her usual determined stride. Her silver hair was neatly styled, and her winter coat was dusted with snow. She took one look at Frank's face and knew something was wrong. "Franklin Porter, what's got you looking like someone stole your favorite rolling pin?" Janet asked, settling onto a stool across from him. Frank managed a weak smile. "That obvious, huh? I've known you for 40 years, Frank. I can read you like one of your recipe books." Janet unwrapped her scarf and leaned forward. "Tell me what's wrong." Frank's fingers tightened around his coffee cup. "Got a call from the landlord this morning. He's raising the rent." His voice cracked slightly. "I can't afford to keep the bakery open anymore." Janet's face softened. "Oh, Frank." She reached across the counter and placed her hand over his. "This place is more than just a bakery. You know that, right? It's where you and Marge built your life together, where you've helped so many people over the years. Maybe it's time to let go," Frank said quietly. "I'm not getting any younger." Janet, "Maybe this is a sign." "Now you listen to me," Janet said firmly. "I watched you and Marge build this place from nothing. I remember how you'd work through the night during the holidays, how you'd give away bread to families who couldn't afford it. Just yesterday, you helped all those bikers during the storm." Frank smiled faintly at the memory. "That was different." "How? Because they were strangers? Because they looked dangerous?" Janet shook her head. "You saw people who needed help, and you helped them. That's who you are, Frank. That's who you've always been." Frank stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the street where, just yesterday, hundreds of bikers had gathered. "Marge would have known what to do," he said softly. "She always knew how to handle these things." "Marge would have told you to fight," Janet replied, joining him at the window. "Remember when that chain bakery opened up across town? Everyone said you'd have to close, but Marge insisted on staying open longer hours, creating new recipes. She never gave up." Frank's eyes misted over as he remembered those days. The late nights experimenting with recipes, Marge's laughter as they covered each other in flour, the triumph when they'd finally turned things around. "I was younger then," Frank said, his voice heavy with resignation. "Had more fight in me. Now." He gestured vaguely at himself. "I'm just tired, Janet. Too old to start over. Too worn out to fight." Janet watched as her brother-in-law's shoulders slumped. The man who had faced down 20 Hell's Angels without flinching now seemed small and uncertain. She wanted to shake him, to make him see what she saw. A man who still had so much to give, who meant so much to so many people. But she recognized the look in his eyes. The same look he'd had after Marge passed, when he needed time to find his own way through the darkness. Frank turned away from the window and walked slowly back to his spot behind the counter, lost in his thoughts about the past and the uncertain future ahead. The evening sun cast long shadows across Main Street as Frank trudged toward his bakery, his shoulders heavy with the weight of his troubles. The day's worries had left him exhausted, and all he wanted was to close up and head home. But as he approached the familiar storefront, he stopped in his tracks. There, leaning against a motorcycle, was Razor. The biker's imposing figure stood out against the quaint bakery backdrop, his leather vest gleaming in the fading light. Frank's heart skipped a beat, not from fear this time, but from surprise. "Evening, old man," Razor called out, his deep voice carrying across the empty street. "Got a minute to talk?" Frank nodded, fishing his keys from his pocket. His hands trembled slightly as he unlocked the door, more from fatigue than nervousness. "Come on in," he said, flicking on the lights. The warm glow illuminated the display cases, now nearly empty after the day's business. Razor followed him inside, his heavy boots echoing on the tile floor. He settled onto one of the stools at the counter, while Frank automatically started brewing a fresh pot of coffee. A habit born from decades of hosting conversations in this very spot. Word travels fast in our circles, Razor began, accepting a steaming mug from Frank. We heard about the rent situation. Frank's shoulders slumped as he leaned against the counter. News travels that fast, huh? Listen, Frank, Razor said, his usual gruff tone softening. The boys and I have been talking. We want to help. We've got the means to buy this place outright. Frank nearly dropped his own coffee mug. Buy the bakery? Yeah. Razor nodded, his eyes serious. Turn it into something special. A place where everyone's welcome. Bikers, townspeople, anyone who needs a warm meal and good company. Keep you as the heart of it all, of course. Frank's mind whirled with the possibility. He glanced around at the worn but well-loved space, at the spot where Marge used to stand, decorating cakes, at the corner booth, where they'd shared countless cups of coffee. I don't know, Razor, Frank said slowly. This place, it's more than just a business to me. That's exactly why we want to help, Razor replied. You showed us kindness when others wouldn't give us a second glance. You saved Darla's life without hesitation. This place? He gestured around the bakery. It's already a sanctuary. We just want to make sure it stays that way. Frank walked over to the wall where photos hung in mismatched frames, snapshots of the bakery through the years. His fingers traced one showing Marge on opening day, her smile radiant as she held up their first batch of cookies. What would it look like? Frank asked quietly. This community hub you're talking about? You'd still run the bakery part, just like always, Razor explained. We'd just make sure you never have to worry about losing it. Add some tables, maybe expand the kitchen. Make it a place where people can come together, share stories, help each other out, just like you helped us. Frank felt tears prickling at the corners of his eyes. He thought about what Marge would say. She'd always believed in second chances, in the good in people. She would have loved the idea of their bakery becoming something bigger, something that could help more people. After a long moment, Frank turned back to Razor. You really think we could make it work? I know we could, Razor said firmly. Frank took a deep breath, studying the earnest expression on the biker's face. Maybe this was exactly what he needed. Not just a solution to his financial troubles, but a way to keep Marge's spirit of kindness alive in a whole new way. All right, Frank said slowly, a small smile forming on his lips. Let's do it. The winter sun cast long shadows through the bakery's windows as Razor spread blueprints across Frank's worn counter. The leather-clad biker's weathered hands smoothed out the wrinkles in the paper with surprising gentleness. Look here, Frank, Razor said, pointing to various marked sections. We've got it all figured out. The main area stays exactly as it is. Your counter, the display cases, that wonderful old oven of yours, but we expand the seating area into the empty storage room next door. Frank adjusted his glasses, studying the detailed plans. His hands trembled slightly as he traced the familiar outline of his beloved bakery. The aroma of fresh bread still lingered in the air, mixing with the leather and tobacco smell that seemed to follow Razor everywhere. We've got support from 3 different motorcycle clubs, Razor continued, his deep voice softening. Plus, some of our members who've done well in business are willing to invest. This isn't charity, Frank. It's an investment in something special. Other bikers had gathered around, their usual intimidating presence somehow comforting now. A tall man with gray-streaked hair stepped forward. Frank remembered him as Danny, one of the veterans who'd visited on Christmas Day. My construction company can handle the renovations, Danny offered. We'll keep the charm intact, just make it more welcoming for everyone. Maybe add a small memorial corner for veterans, if you're okay with that. Frank's eyes misted as he imagined what they were describing. The walls would still hold the photos of him and Marge from decades ago, but new memories could be added. The thought both thrilled and terrified him. "We're thinking of calling it Frank's Haven," Razor said, watching Frank's reaction carefully. "A place where anyone can come in, grab a coffee and a pastry, and just belong. No judgments, no questions asked." A younger biker named Tommy chimed in, "My sister's an accountant. She's already drawn up the business plan. The numbers look good, Frank. Real good." Frank walked slowly around his counter, running his hand along its smooth surface. Every nick and scratch told a story, like the deep groove from when he'd dropped a heavy mixing bowl the day after Marge's funeral. He'd been too distraught to even clean up properly. "It's a lot to take in," Frank said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "This place, it's been my whole life. Marge and I built it together." Razor placed a gentle hand on Frank's shoulder. "And it will still be yours. We're just helping you make it something bigger, something that can help others the way you helped us." Frank looked around at the faces watching him, faces that just days ago would have terrified him, but now felt like family. Each one held a mixture of hope and understanding, waiting patiently for his decision. "What if I'm too old for such a big change?" Frank whispered, voicing his deepest fear. "What if I can't keep up?" "You won't have to do it alone," Razor assured him. "We'll be here, all of us." Frank picked up one of Marge's old recipe cards that he kept near the register. Her handwriting was still clear and elegant, a recipe for her famous cinnamon rolls. He remembered how she always said their bakery should be more than just a business. It should be a home for those who needed one. The idea began to take root in his mind, scary but somehow right. Maybe this was exactly what Marge would have wanted. His heart raced with equal parts excitement and anxiety as he considered the possibility of this new chapter in his life. Frank stood in the doorway of his bakery, his heart beating faster than usual as he took in the changes. The old wooden chairs had been replaced with comfortable leather-cushioned seats, and new oak tables dotted the expanded dining area. Warm light filtered through freshly cleaned windows, catching the shine of the polished counter where he'd served customers for decades. "What do you think, old man?" Razor's deep voice came from behind him. The biker leader had spent the past week overseeing the renovations, making sure everything met Frank's standards. Frank ran his hand along the smooth surface of the new counter. "It's different," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion, "but different in a good way." His eyes caught sight of Marge's old recipe book, still sitting in its place of honor near the register. Some things hadn't changed. The sound of motorcycles rumbling outside drew their attention. A group of bikers pulled up, followed by several cars carrying local townspeople. Frank recognized Janet among them, her familiar face beaming with approval as she entered. "This is amazing, Frank," she exclaimed, looking around in wonder. "Marge would have loved this." The space quickly filled with an eclectic mix of leather-clad bikers and curious locals. Frank watched as they naturally gravitated toward the coffee station he'd set up in the corner, complete with comfortable armchairs arranged in a circle. The smell of fresh-baked goods wafted through the air. He'd been up since dawn preparing his signature cinnamon rolls and apple pies. "Hey, Frank," called out one of the bikers, a younger man named Tommy. "Mind if I put some music on?" He gestured to the new sound system the group had installed. Frank nodded, and soon soft jazz filled the air, the kind Marge used to love. The music seemed to break any remaining tension, and conversations started flowing naturally between the unlikely groups of people. In one corner, an elderly veteran was sharing stories with three young bikers, who listened intently. Near the window, Janet chatted with a tough-looking woman covered in tattoos, both of them laughing over cups of coffee. The scene before him was unlike anything Frank had ever imagined for his humble bakery. Razor appeared at his side again, holding out a fresh cup of coffee. "You know what makes this place special?" he asked, his usually gruff voice softened. "It's not just the food or the fancy new furniture. It's you, Frank. You've got this way of making everyone feel welcome, like they belong. Frank accepted the coffee, watching as more people filed in. A young woman with tired eyes and a small child found a seat near the window, and immediately, one of the bikers offered to grab them some hot chocolate. The woman's tense shoulders relaxed as she was welcomed into the group. "I never thought I'd see anything like this," Frank admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "All these years, I've been baking to keep Marge's memory alive. But maybe," he paused, gathering his thoughts, "maybe she left me this gift, this ability to bring people together." The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows as Frank moved behind the counter, pulling out a fresh batch of cookies. He watched as hands reached out to help distribute them, watched as strangers became friends over shared stories and warm food. The bakery hummed with life and laughter, filled with a kind of energy he hadn't felt since Marge was alive. In every corner, he could see healing happening, in the shy smiles of lonely people finding connection, in the understanding nods between veterans sharing their experiences, in the gentle ways the bikers helped elderly customers to their seats. His bakery had become more than just a place to get something sweet. It had become a sanctuary where barriers dissolved and hearts opened. Frank wiped down the counter for the third time, his movements slower than usual. The bakery was empty now, save for the lingering scent of coffee and pastries. Outside, the streetlights cast long shadows through the windows, and the occasional rumble of motorcycles echoed in the distance. His hands trembled slightly as he looked around the transformed space. Where there had once been simple wooden chairs and tables, now stood leather booths and chrome-trimmed furniture. Photos of motorcycles lined the walls alongside his old family pictures. The changes were striking, and while the bakery had been bustling all day, something felt off. "What would you think of all this, Marge?" he whispered to himself, touching the wedding ring he still wore. The day had been successful. More customers than he'd seen in years, laughter filling every corner, and stories being shared over fresh-baked goods. But it didn't feel like his bakery anymore. Frank walked to the wall where Marge's favorite photo still hung, the two of them on their wedding day, young and full of dreams. Next to it now was a large photo of dozens of bikers gathered outside the bakery on Christmas Day. The contrast made his chest tighten. He pulled out his old recipe book, its pages worn and stained with years of use. Marge's handwriting filled the margins with notes and suggestions. "Add more vanilla," she'd written on the snickerdoodle recipe. "Perfect for cold days." On the apple pie instructions, these were the touches that had made the bakery feel like home. Now everything felt different. The bikers who'd visited today were kind, even gentle in their own way. They'd shown nothing but respect, helping elderly customers to their seats and listening intently to veterans who stopped by to share their stories. But Frank felt like a stranger in his own shop, unsure of his place in this new world. He sank into one of the new leather chairs, his joints aching from the long day. The sound of motorcycles grew louder, then cut off abruptly outside. Frank's heart quickened. He wasn't ready for more visitors, not when he was feeling so uncertain. The bell above the door chimed, and Razor's massive frame filled the doorway. The biker's face softened when he saw Frank sitting alone in the dimly lit bakery. "Thought I might find you here," Razor said, his voice gentler than his appearance would suggest. He carried something draped over his karos. "Arm." "Just closing up," Frank replied, standing slowly. "It's been quite a day." Razor nodded, studying Frank's face. "Something's bothering you, old man?" "I can see it in your eyes." Frank hesitated, then gestured around the bakery. "It's all so different now. Sometimes I wonder if I've made a mistake, changing everything Marge and I built together." "Changes don't erase what came before," Razor said, stepping forward. "They build on it." He held out what he'd been carrying, a leather jacket, new and gleaming in the soft light. When Razor turned it over, Frank saw the word family written in bold letters across the back. "You're one of us now," Razor said simply, holding out the jacket. "And we're yours." Frank reached out, his fingers brushing the smooth leather. The word family blurred as tears filled his eyes. He hadn't felt this sense of belonging since Marge passed away, hadn't realized how much he'd missed being part of something bigger than himself. The seasons changed, and with them, Frank's bakery transformed into something he never could have imagined. Spring brought motorcycle rallies, summer welcomed charity rides, and fall saw gatherings of veterans sharing stories over coffee and pie. Now, as winter settled in again, Frank couldn't help but marvel at how different his life had become. "Hey, old-timer," Razor called out one morning, helping himself to a fresh cinnamon roll. "These are still the best I've ever had." Frank smiled, wiping flour from his hands. "Your mother might disagree with that." "Nah, even she admits it. Actually asked me to get the recipe last week." Razor chuckled, his leather jacket creaking as he leaned against the counter. The bakery had kept its charm but gained character. Photos of smiling bikers lined the walls, mixed with old pictures of Frank and Marge. A shelf displayed various patches and pins gifted by visiting motorcycle clubs. The worn leather couch in the corner had become a favorite spot for heart-to-heart conversations. "You know, Frank," Razor said, his voice softening, "Tommy finally got clean last month. Says coming here, talking to you, it helped him stay strong." Frank nodded, remembering the young biker who'd struggled with addiction. "He's a good kid, just needed someone to believe in him." Throughout the year, Frank had learned each of their stories. There was Mike, who'd lost his wife to cancer and found solace in the brotherhood. Sarah, a female rider who escaped an abusive relationship and rebuilt her life. And countless others who'd found their way to his bakery, seeking more than just fresh bread and coffee. The town had changed too. People who once crossed the street at the sight of motorcycles now waved hello. The bakery hosted community events, bringing together folks who might never have spoken otherwise. Even the local police chief stopped by regularly, sharing donuts with the same bikers he used to eye suspiciously. One particularly cold morning, Frank arrived to find a group of bikers already waiting. They'd organized a toy drive for the children's hospital, and his bakery was the collection point. Watching tough-looking men carefully arranging stuffed animals and wrapped presents, Frank felt his heart swell with pride. "Never thought I'd see the day," Janet remarked during one of her visits. "You've got yourself a whole new family here." Frank glanced at the leather jacket hanging behind the counter, his jacket with family written across the back. "Marge would have loved this," he said softly. "She always said the bakery needed more life in it." The bikers had become protective of Frank, checking on him during bad weather, helping with deliveries, and making sure he didn't work too hard. In return, he offered them what they needed most: a place to belong, a sympathetic ear, and the kind of wisdom that only comes from a lifetime of experiences. As Christmas approached again, the bakery buzzed with activity. The bikers decorated the place, hanging lights and garlands everywhere. Even the massive Christmas tree in the corner sported ornaments shaped like motorcycles alongside traditional baubles. When Christmas Eve arrived, the familiar rumble of motorcycles filled the street. But this time, they brought more than just their brotherhood. Wives, children, and parents stepped through the door, arms full of presents and food. The small bakery overflowed with laughter and warmth as families shared stories and broke bread together. Frank stood behind his counter, watching the scene unfold. Children ran between leather-clad legs, elderly parents sat chatting with tattooed bikers, and the air was filled with the smell of fresh-baked goods and the sound of joy. Frank stood behind the counter of his bakery, taking in the heartwarming scene before him. The usually quiet space was alive with chatter and laughter. Christmas lights twinkled from every corner, casting a warm glow over the leather-clad bikers and their families who filled every seat and corner. Razor sat at his usual spot at the counter, nursing a cup of hot cocoa. His weathered face softened as he watched his fellow bikers sharing stories and passing around plates of Frank's fresh-baked cookies. Next to him, Darla helped arrange a display of gingerbread houses that the children had decorated earlier. "Remember last Christmas, Frank?" Darla asked, adjusting her leather jacket. "I was so sick, and you took care of me without even knowing who I was." Her eyes glistened with gratitude. Frank nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "Seems like yesterday and a lifetime ago all at once," he said, his voice gentle. The bakery looked different now. Photos lined the walls, snapshots of bikers and townspeople together at various events throughout the year. A special corner was dedicated to veterans, with a small Christmas tree decorated with military medallions and personal mementos. The old bench where Marge used to sit had been restored, now bearing a small plaque with her name. "Hey, old man," Razor called out, getting everyone's attention. "Got something for you?" He pulled out a carefully wrapped package from his jacket. The room quieted as Frank unwrapped the gift. Inside was a framed photograph of the entire group, taken during their first Christmas together. Frank recognized himself in the center, surrounded by leather-clad bikers, all smiling. Below the photo was an engraving that read, "Family isn't always blood. It's the people who accept you for who you are." "We had it made special," Darla explained, moving closer. "Because that's what you did for us, Frank. You accepted us when others wouldn't even look our way." Frank ran his fingers over the frame, remembering how uncertain he'd been that first night when 20 Hell's Angels had stormed into his bakery. Now, looking around at the faces he'd grown to know and love over the past year, he could hardly believe he'd ever hesitated to let them in. Children darted between tables, their laughter mixing with the sound of Christmas carols playing softly in the background. Some of the bikers' kids had taken to calling him Grandpa Frank, a title that warmed his heart more than they could know. In one corner, a young veteran who'd started visiting the bakery regularly was teaching some children how to make paper snowflakes. Near the window, 3 bikers were helping an elderly woman wrap presents for her grandchildren. The scene before him was nothing like the quiet, solitary Christmas he'd imagined for himself a year ago. The bakery had become more than just a place to get fresh bread and pastries. It was a sanctuary where people from all walks of life could find acceptance and understanding. Frank watched as Razor helped a young boy reach the cookie jar, his tough exterior melting away as he shared a conspiratorial wink with the child. A wave of contentment washed over Frank as he absorbed the scene. The void left by Marge's passing would always be there, but it no longer felt like an empty space. Instead, it had been filled with something different but equally precious, a family he never expected to have, brought together by an act of kindness on a stormy Christmas Eve. The early morning sun cast long shadows through the bakery windows as Frank wiped down the counter, preparing for another day. The familiar scent of fresh bread and cinnamon rolls filled the air, bringing a smile to his weathered face. His hands, rough from years of kneading dough, moved with practiced efficiency as he arranged pastries in the display case. The bell above the door chimed, and Frank's stomach tightened when he saw Mr. Henderson, his landlord, step inside. The man clutched an envelope in his hands, his expression unreadable. Frank's mind raced back to their last conversation about raising the rent, and his throat went dry. He set down the cleaning cloth and straightened his apron, trying to maintain his composure. "Morning, Mr. Henderson," Frank said, his voice slightly shaky. "Can I get you some coffee?" The landlord shook his head, tapping the envelope against his palm. "No. Thank you, Frank. I need to discuss something with you." He glanced around the bakery, taking in the photographs of bikers and community members that now adorned the walls, alongside the old pictures of Marge. Frank's hands trembled slightly as he gripped the edge of the counter. The past few months had been wonderful. The bakery had become more than just a business. It was a sanctuary for so many people. The thought of losing it now, just when everything was falling into place, made his chest ache. "Of course," Frank managed, gesturing to a nearby table. "Please, have a seat." Mr. Henderson settled into the chair, placing the envelope on the table between them. Frank lowered himself into the opposite seat, his joints creaking slightly. The morning silence felt heavy, broken only by the gentle hum of the ovens. "Frank," Mr. Henderson began, "I've been watching what's been happening here these past few months." He paused, running a hand through his gray hair. "When I first heard about the bikers, I'll admit I was concerned. This building's been in my family for generations, and I worried about its reputation." Frank's heart sank further. He thought about Razor and the others, about how they'd become like family to him, about all the lives that had been touched by this unexpected community. "Henderson, I can assure you." The landlord held up his hand, stopping Frank mid-sentence. "Let me finish." He smiled, surprising Frank. "I've seen something remarkable happen here. I've watched tough-looking bikers help elderly ladies across the street. I've seen them shoveling snow for neighbors, organizing food drives, and creating a real sense of community." Frank felt his eyes growing misty as Mr. Henderson continued. "Last week, I saw one of those bikers, the big one with all the tattoos, reading stories to kids from the elementary school. And yesterday, I watched as they helped Mrs. Johnson move into her new apartment after she lost her house." Mr. Henderson's voice grew warmer. "This isn't just a bakery anymore, Frank. It's become the heart of our town." He picked up the envelope and handed it to Frank. "I came to tell you that I've decided to keep the rent as is. No increases for the foreseeable future." Frank stared at the envelope, his vision blurring with tears. His hands shook as he accepted it, overwhelming relief washing over him. The weight that had been pressing on his chest for months suddenly lifted, and he found himself struggling to find the right words to express his gratitude. The bell above the bakery door chimed as Razor ducked his head to enter, followed by 3 other bikers. The morning sun cast long shadows through the front windows, and the smell of fresh bread filled the air. Frank looked up from where he was arranging pastries in the display case, a warm smile spreading across his weathered face. "Morning, Frank," Razor said, his voice gentle despite his imposing presence. He pulled off his leather gloves and tucked them into his back pocket. The other bikers, Big Mike, Sarah, and Doc, spread out around the counter, their faces serious but friendly. Frank wiped his hands on his apron. "Coffee's fresh if you'd like some." "Actually," Razor said, settling onto a stool at the counter, "we came to talk about something important." He gestured for Frank to sit down. Frank's heart skipped a beat, but he kept his expression neutral as he poured coffee for everyone. The ceramic mugs clinked against the counter as he distributed them. "What's on your mind?" Frank asked, finally taking a seat across from Razor. Sarah, a tall woman with silver-streaked hair, leaned forward. "We've been watching what's happened here, Frank. This place, what you've created, it's special. It's more than just a bakery now. It's become a sanctuary," Big Mike added, his deep voice rumbling through the quiet morning air. "A place where people can come together no matter who they are." Razor nodded, wrapping his hands around his coffee mug. "We've been thinking. There are other towns, other communities that need what we've built here. Veterans struggling to find their place, small businesses about to go under, families who just need a helping hand." Doc, who rarely spoke, cleared his throat. "We want to expand this mission, Frank. Take it regional, maybe even further." Frank's eyebrows rose as he listened. The morning light caught the dust motes dancing in the air, and somewhere in the kitchen, the timer dinged for the morning's first batch of cinnamon rolls. "And we want you to be the face of it," Razor said, his eyes meeting Frank's. "You've got something special, old man. People trust you." They see past appearances and labels when they're around you. That's exactly what we need." Frank's hands trembled slightly as he set down his coffee cup. I don't know," he said quietly. "I'm just a baker. This place," he gestured around the bakery, "this is my world. Has been for decades." Sarah reached across the counter and placed her hand over Frank's. "You stopped being just a baker the moment you opened your doors to us that Christmas Eve. You're a bridge builder now, Frank. You bring people together." "Remember how scared you were about all this changing?" Big Mike asked, sweeping his arm around the renovated bakery. "Look at it now. Look at what you've helped create." Frank stood up slowly, walking to the window. He could see the town coming to life outside, people walking past, nodding and waving at the bikers' motorcycles parked outside. They weren't afraid anymore. They understood. "You're right," Frank said softly, turning back to face the group. "I've spent so many years thinking small, staying safe in my little corner of the world. But maybe—" He paused, thinking of Marge, knowing she would be proud of what he'd accomplished. "Maybe it's time to think bigger." Razor stood up, his face breaking into a rare smile. "So you'll do it?" Frank looked around his bakery, at the photos on the walls showing bikers and townspeople together, at the community bulletin board filled with needs and offers of help, at the table where veterans gathered every morning to share coffee and understanding. "Yes," Frank said, his voice growing stronger. "Yes, I'll do it." Frank stood in the doorway of his bakery, watching as Razor and 3 other bikers carefully mounted a new wooden sign above the entrance. The fresh paint gleamed in the morning sun. "Porter's Community Bakery, where everyone belongs." His heart swelled with a mixture of pride and nervousness as he observed the changes taking place. Inside, the familiar scent of cinnamon and fresh bread mingled with the smell of new wood and paint. The bakery had been expanded, with Razor and his crew working tirelessly to add a community space adjacent to the main area. New tables and chairs, crafted by one of the bikers who turned out to be a skilled carpenter, filled the space. Warm lighting fixtures hung from the ceiling, casting a gentle glow over the freshly painted walls. "What do you think, old man?" Razor asked, wiping his hands on a rag as he stepped back inside. His leather vest was covered in sawdust, but his eyes sparkled with enthusiasm. Frank ran his hand along one of the new wooden benches. "It's different," he admitted. "Good different, but still strange to see my little bakery turned into something so much bigger." A group of veterans had already claimed one corner as their regular meeting spot, complete with a coffee station and comfortable chairs. The wall behind them was adorned with service photos and American flags. Another area had been set aside for support group meetings, with chairs arranged in a circle and motivational posters carefully placed on the walls. "Remember when you first met us?" Razor chuckled, helping Frank move a display case to its new location. "Who would have thought a bunch of bikers would end up helping you rebuild?" Frank smiled, remembering that stormy Christmas Eve. "Life has a way of surprising us," he said softly. "Marge would have loved all this, you know. She always said the bakery should be more than just a place to buy bread." 2 more bikers entered, carrying boxes of donated books for the small reading nook they'd created. The space was becoming a true community center, with notices for local events pinned to a bulletin board and sign-up sheets for various support groups. "It's a lot of responsibility," Frank murmured, watching as people began filtering in for their morning coffee. "All these folks counting on this place for more than just pastries." Razor placed a firm hand on Frank's shoulder. "That's why we're here to help. You gave us a chance when others wouldn't. Now we're returning the favor." Throughout the morning, Frank watched as different groups claimed their spaces. A young mothers group settled in with their children, while veterans gathered for their weekly coffee meetup. The bikers had become regular fixtures, helping maintain order and making everyone feel welcome. Looking around at the renovated space, Frank felt a profound sense of purpose. The original bakery counter still stood proud, but now it was surrounded by so much more: comfortable seating areas, meeting spaces, and most importantly, people coming together. The walls that had once witnessed his solitary work now echoed with conversation and laughter. As he adjusted a fresh batch of cookies in the display case, Frank caught his reflection in the glass. He was still the same baker he'd always been, but somehow different too. The responsibility didn't feel as heavy as he'd feared. Instead, it felt right, like this was what the bakery had been meant to become all along. The autumn breeze carried the scent of pumpkin pie and fresh bread through the bakery's open doors. Inside, the warmth of ovens and bodies pressed together created a cozy atmosphere that made Frank's heart swell. The bakery, once his quiet sanctuary, now buzzed with life and laughter as both bikers and townspeople gathered for their first community Thanksgiving celebration. Frank watched from behind his worn wooden counter as Razor helped Janet, Marge's sister, arrange plates of steaming turkey on the buffet table they'd set up. The sight of leather-clad bikers working alongside elderly church ladies to set out casseroles and cranberry sauce brought a smile to his weathered face. "Need any help with those rolls, Frank?" called out Darla, the diabetic woman whose life he'd saved that fateful Christmas Eve. She'd become one of his most dedicated helpers, learning his recipes and sharing her own. "Almost done," Frank replied, pulling another tray from the oven. The golden brown rolls released a heavenly aroma that drew appreciative murmurs from nearby guests. The bakery looked different now. The walls, freshly painted in warm cream, displayed photos of both old and new memories. Pictures of Marge, beside snapshots of bikers helping at community events. New chairs and tables filled the expanded dining area, but Frank had kept his original counter, its surface marked with decades of flour and love. Children darted between adults' legs, their laughter mixing with the classic rock music playing softly from the new speakers Razor had installed. Frank noticed how the townspeople, who had once crossed the street to avoid the bikers, now sat shoulder to shoulder with them, sharing stories and passing dishes. "Remember when we first came in here?" asked one of the bikers, Tommy, as he helped himself to more mashed potatoes. "Thought the old man might have a heart attack. Instead, he gave us hearts of our own." Another biker chimed in, raising his coffee cup in Frank's direction. Frank felt his eyes grow misty as he looked around at what his bakery had become. Where once there had been emptiness and echoes of Marge's absence, now there was life, purpose, and family. The support groups that met here weekly had helped countless veterans and lonely souls find connection. The bikers' presence had transformed from something feared into a symbol of protection and community strength. Mayor Thompson, who'd initially been skeptical of the changes, stood chatting with a group of bikers about their latest charity ride. The local paper had even run a story about how the unlikely partnership between an old baker and the Hells Angels had revitalized the town's spirit. As the feast continued, Frank moved through the crowd, accepting hugs and thanks, filling coffee cups, and listening to snippets of conversation. He couldn't help but think of Marge and how much she would have loved this, the bakery full of joy and purpose, helping people find their way home. The afternoon light began to fade, casting long shadows through the windows. Some guests started gathering their coats and empty dishes, while others lingered over coffee and pie. Frank felt a familiar presence beside him as Razor approached, his usually stern face softened with emotion. Without warning, Razor wrapped Frank in a bear hug, his leather jacket creaking with the movement. "You've done more than save your bakery," Razor said, his voice thick with feeling. "You've saved all of us." Frank stood there, unable to speak, overwhelmed by the truth of those words and the depth of connection he felt with these people who had become his family. The morning dew clung to the grass as Frank made his way through the cemetery's winding path. He held a small bouquet of daisies, Marge's favorite flowers, in his weathered hands. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, casting long shadows across the headstones. Frank knew this path by heart. He'd walked it countless times over the years. At Marge's grave, he carefully brushed away some fallen leaves and placed the flowers in the small metal vase. The morning was quiet, except for the gentle rustling of trees and distant birdsong. Frank lowered himself onto the small bench he'd placed here years ago, his joints creaking slightly as he settled in. "Morning, sweetheart," he said softly, his voice carrying the warmth it always had when he spoke to her. "You wouldn't believe how different things are now." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Remember how quiet our lives used to be? Just us and the bakery?" Frank ran his hand along the smooth surface of the bench, feeling the grain of the wood beneath his fingers. "The bakery's different now, Marge. It's full of life, more than ever before. We've got bikers coming in and out all day long. Can you imagine? Hell's Angels in our little bakery?" He smiled, remembering how nervous he'd been that first night. "They're good people, though. Rough around the edges, sure, but their hearts are in the right place. Razor, that's their leader. He reminds me a bit of your brother Tommy. Same kind of tough exterior but soft inside." A gentle breeze rustled through the trees, and Frank pulled his jacket closer. "The whole town's changed because of them. We're helping people now, more than just feeding them. Veterans come in for support groups, and we've started hosting community events. The bakery's become something bigger than I ever imagined." He paused, his voice growing softer. "Sometimes I wonder what you'd think of all this. Would you approve of your quiet, predictable husband running around with bikers?" Frank laughed quietly. "I can almost hear you saying, 'Franklin Porter, since when do you care what anyone thinks?'" Frank reached out and touched the cool stone of her headstone. "I miss you every day, Marge. But I'm not lonely anymore. These people, they've become family. They look out for me, just like you always did. And I get to look out for them, too." The morning sun had risen higher now, warming his face. "Remember how you always said the bakery needed more than just good recipes? That it needed heart? Well, it's got that now. More heart than I know what to do with sometimes." Standing slowly, Frank brushed off his pants and took one last look at the flowers. "I think you'd like what we've built, Marge. It's different, but it's good. These bikers, they understand about family and loyalty, just like you always did." As he turned to leave, Frank felt a familiar warmth in his chest, the kind he used to feel when Marge would smile at him across their kitchen table. The weight of loneliness that had been his constant companion for so long felt lighter now, replaced by something new and wonderful. Walking back toward the bakery, Frank felt at peace. The morning sun painted everything in a soft, golden light, and he could already hear the distant rumble of motorcycles, his new family arriving for another day. He smiled, knowing that Marge was still with him, her love living on in the warmth and connection he'd found in his unexpected new life. The bakery came into view, and Frank straightened his shoulders. He had pies to bake, stories to hear, and people to care for. His step was lighter now, filled with purpose and joy. Marge would have wanted this for him, not just survival, but truly living again. Frank adjusted his apron as he surveyed the transformed bakery. Garlands of pine and twinkling lights draped across the windows, and the scent of cinnamon and nutmeg filled the air. Christmas was just around the corner, but this year felt different. The once quiet shop now hummed with activity as volunteers, both bikers and townspeople, worked together, sorting donations and wrapping presents. "Need any help with those boxes, Frank?" called out Janet, Marge's sister, who had become a regular fixture at these community events. "I've got it," he replied, carefully stacking empty cardboard boxes near the back door. His joints weren't as flexible as they used to be, but the energy in the room kept him moving. The charity drive had exceeded everyone's expectations. Tables lined the walls, loaded with wrapped gifts, canned goods, and warm clothing. Local businesses had pitched in, too, offering gift certificates and services. Even the town's more skeptical residents had come around, impressed by how the bikers had organized everything. "Hey, old man!" Darla's voice carried across the room as she burst through the door, her arms full of more donations. "You wouldn't believe how many people stopped us on the road to add to the pile." Frank smiled, remembering how, just a year ago, the sight of bikers would have sent people running. Now, the leather-clad men and women were welcomed everywhere they went. They had become guardians of sorts, watching out for struggling businesses and families in need. The bell above the door chimed continuously as people came and went. Some dropped off donations, others picked up food boxes, and many simply stopped by to chat and enjoy a cup of hot cocoa. Frank had to admit, the bakery had never felt more alive. Mr. Porter, a young veteran, approached him, clutching his cap in his hands. "I just wanted to say thank you. Last year, my family was struggling, and your food bank really helped us through. This year, we're doing better, and we wanted to give back." He gestured to his wife and children, who were helping sort through donations. Frank patted the man's shoulder, touched by his words. This was exactly what he and the bikers had hoped to create. A cycle of community support, where those who received help would one day be able to help others. As evening approached, the crowd thinned out. Frank was wiping down the counter when he heard the familiar rumble of motorcycles. Through the frosted windows, he could make out Razor's imposing figure, leading a group of bikers carrying something large. The bell jingled as they filed in, their faces split with grins. "Frank," Razor called out, "we've got something for you. Come outside." Curious, Frank followed them out into the crisp winter air. There, propped carefully against the wall, was a magnificent wooden sign. The craftsmanship was beautiful, with hand-carved letters that read, "The Old Baker's Family Bakery." The wood was stained a rich brown, and small details, like tiny motorcycles and rolling pins, were carved into the corners. "Razor, Frank's voice caught in his throat as he traced the letters with his fingers. "You gave us a family when we needed one," Razor said, his gruff voice softening. "Seemed only right to make it official." Frank stared at the sign, his vision blurring with tears. The word family seemed to glow in the evening light, and he could almost hear Marge whispering, "See, you're never alone, my love." Around him, bikers and townspeople gathered, their faces reflecting the warmth that had become the hallmark of his bakery. This wasn't just a business anymore. It was a home, a sanctuary, a place where anyone could find acceptance and support. Frank Porter stood in his bakery on Christmas morning, his weathered hands resting on the freshly wiped counter. Through the window, golden sunlight sparkled off the pristine snow outside, casting a warm glow across the bustling room. The space that had once felt so empty now brimmed with life and laughter. Near the window, a group of veterans huddled around a table with several bikers, their coffee cups steaming. One older veteran, his military cap adorned with pins, gestured animatedly as he shared stories with a tattooed biker who listened intently, nodding with understanding. The sight made Frank's heart swell. These were two groups who might never have crossed paths if not for this place. Children darted between tables, their faces sticky with powdered sugar from Frank's famous Christmas morning donuts. Their parents called after them half-heartedly, too caught up in their own conversations to truly mind the holiday chaos. A young girl with pigtails offered her donut to a leather-clad biker, who accepted it with a gentle smile that would have surprised Frank just a year ago. In the corner, Mrs. Thompson, who had lived alone since her husband passed, sat with three other elderly couples. They passed around small, wrapped presents, their eyes twinkling with joy. Frank remembered how Mrs. Thompson used to come to the bakery alone every morning, barely speaking a word. Now, she was one of the most active members of their little community. The new wooden sign above the entrance caught the morning light, casting shadows that danced across the floor. The old baker's family bakery. The words meant more to Frank now than ever before. He watched as Darla, the woman whose life he'd saved during that fateful Christmas Eve storm, helped serve coffee to newcomers. She'd become one of his most reliable volunteers, always ready with a kind word or helping hand. The aroma of cinnamon rolls wafted from the kitchen where Janet, Marge's sister, had insisted on helping this morning. She'd adapted surprisingly well to their unconventional family, saying it had brought back the spark in Frank's eyes that she hadn't seen since Marge passed. A group of bikers from 3 different clubs stood near the counter, sharing stories and laughing together. Frank remembered how they used to eye each other warily on the roads. Now they were trading Christmas cookies and planning charity rides together. The transformation wasn't lost on Frank. His bakery had become more than just a meeting place. It was a bridge between worlds. Frank felt a strong hand on his shoulder and turned to find Razor standing beside him. The biker leader's eyes scanned the room, taking in the scene of harmony and joy before them. His usual stern expression had softened into one of contentment. "This is the best Christmas yet," Razor said, giving Frank's shoulder a gentle squeeze. Frank nodded, his throat tight with emotion as he surveyed the room. Every face told a story of connection, of barriers broken down and friendships forged in the most unexpected places. He thought about how lonely he'd been just a year ago, how he'd convinced himself that his time for meaningful relationships had passed. Now, looking at the gathering before him, he understood that family wasn't defined by blood or background. It was about the connections we choose to make, the love we choose to give, and the community we choose to build. Frank stood behind the counter of his bakery, marveling at how much had changed in just 1 year. The once quiet shop now buzzed with life and laughter. Bikers in leather jackets mingled with elderly ladies discussing recipe tips, while veterans shared coffee with young families. The wooden beams overhead were draped with twinkling lights, and the air smelled of cinnamon and fresh bread. Razor was at his usual spot near the window, bent over a map spread across the table. Several other bikers huddled around him, pointing and making notes. They were planning their next community outreach project, IMT, delivering supplies to homeless shelters across the county. "Hey, Frank!" Razor called out, waving him over. "Come take a look at this route we mapped out." Frank wiped his flour-covered hands on his apron and made his way to their table. His steps were lighter these days, his shoulders straighter. The loneliness that had weighed him down for so long after Marge's passing had lifted, replaced by a sense of purpose he never expected to find. "We figure we can hit all these shelters in 2 days, Razor explained, tracing a line across the map with his finger. "The bakery's donations will make a real difference." Frank nodded, remembering how just a year ago he'd been ready to give up on everything. Now, his little bakery had become the heart of something much bigger than himself. The townspeople, who had once crossed the street to avoid the bikers, now worked alongside them, organizing food drives and fundraisers. Mrs. Henderson, his most particular customer, was chatting with Tank, one of the burliest bikers, about her grandson's college applications. In the corner, Sarah from the flower shop was teaching 2 younger bikers how to arrange centerpieces for the upcoming veterans' dinner. The bell above the door chimed as the mayor walked in, carrying a framed newspaper article. "Frank!" she called out, holding up the frame. "This belongs on your wall of fame." The article's headline read, "Local Baker and Biker Club Transform Community." Frank felt his cheeks warm as several customers gathered around to look at the photo of him and Razor standing in front of the bakery. "Never thought I'd see my ugly mug in the paper," Razor chuckled, but Frank could see the pride in his eyes. A young girl tugged at Frank's apron. "Mr. Porter, can you teach me how to make those special cookies like you promised?" "Of course, sweetheart," Frank replied, leading her to the kitchen where he kept a special step stool for young helpers. As he helped her measure ingredients, he caught sight of Marge's photo on the wall. She was smiling, that warm smile he loved so much, and he could almost hear her saying, "See, Frank, there's always room for more love in your heart." The afternoon light began to fade, and Frank noticed the first snowflakes of the evening drifting past the window. It reminded him of that Christmas Eve when everything changed, when a group of strangers became family. The bakery glowed with warmth against the growing darkness outside, a beacon of hope and community. The bell above the door chimed again. Frank looked up, a genuine smile spreading across his face as he prepared to greet another member of his ever-growing family.